BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Tina Dahealy. You're listening to Beyond Today from BBC Radio 4, the space to ask one big question about one big story. Today we're asking, how dangerous are far-right hipsters?
Hi folks, my name is Martin Sellner. I'm an Austrian patriot and identitarian activist, and behind me you can see the beautiful Austrian landscape.
Now, at the end of last week, a story surfaced that seemed, on the face of it, a little bit odd. A far-right YouTuber in Austria, Martin Sellner, had his house raided by the authorities there after revealing he'd received a $1,500 donation from the suspect in the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand. His American girlfriend is furious that he's now being linked to the attack.
Martin has never met the shooter, not to mention he staunchly opposes the shooter's belief in violence. The key word here is link. Link implies that Martin had been working together with the shooter, that he endorses his state of mind and his actions, and that he was somehow involved in the shooting.
So what is the link between a self-proclaimed non-violent far-right YouTuber and a suspected mass murderer? And what can it tell us about how radical ideas become mainstream? It's a story that's going to take us from the world of YouTubers all the way back to the Crusades. It's important to say Martin Sellner isn't a big deal, nor does he have a massive following, but his story does tell us something important about how radical ideas spread around the world. One man who's met him is BBC reporter Simon Cox.
He was very friendly. As you will know, when you're doing interviews, often before you talk to people, they will want some kind of brief, what are the areas you're going to talk about? There was none of that. Just arrived. We went to their offices, which are in the centre of Vienna. He said, don't tell anyone where it is because, we could face attacks. But it's in an old historic building. It's an apartment. Not particularly flash, but we sat in the kitchen there and we talked for a long time.
Because this community, yes, because this community is giving.
He's very clean cut, super articulate. He's got a nice short haircut. He always wears these black rimmed glasses, and he is often on social media, often on YouTube, talking about his theories and why white people, Christians are at risk, and particularly from Muslims. That's his big obsession. His mentor was this guy who is now in prison for 9 years for neo-Nazi offences. There are really strict laws in Austria. But he sort of hung around in those circles and then had decided to set up his own movement in 2012, which is where Generation Identity sprang up in Austria.
Is that what it's called?
Yeah, it's called Generation Identity, GI. There's lots of movements around Europe. It started in France. There's a big branch in France, Germany, Austria. They're really super slick. They had this video. They've got various videos, one of which didn't quite work out as they wanted, but they hired a boat and it cost about £150,000 that they said was all through little donations. He has a lot of money. And they were basically harassing NGO ships that were trying to rescue migrants who were out in the Mediterranean.
Get in front, Thomas! Get in front! Stop that boat! Stop that boat! Stop that boat!
They always present their actions as a massive success. We did really well. And certainly if you look at their video output and their output on social media, it looks like it's a success. They will get a fair amount of them being liked and shared then, certainly by their supporters across Europe, but also in America as well.
How much support do they have and how big are they? I hadn't heard of them.
So they don't have much physical support on the ground. They had this strange far-right festival last summer called Europa Nostra in Dresden in eastern Germany. And it was a bit like a kind of it was a small scale festival, their little plastic tents, talks from people. So we'd sent someone along, and it was quite small scale. But the interesting thing was there was a massive counter protest, loads of police, more police and more counter protesters. But it was, a gathering of like-minded people, mostly from Germany and Austria, some from a bit further afield. So you don't see much on the ground, but it's online. So Martin Sellner, he's been banned from a fair bit of social media. He's got about 90,000 followers on his YouTube channel. So, okay, not massive, but then he's also got his fiancée, Brittany Pettibone.
Hey guys, I've been in a secret location working on a project for the past 2 weeks straight.
Who is an American alt-right, far-right vlogger. She's got more followers on YouTube. She's got just over 100,000. So between them, a fair
The ultimate
following.
power couple on the far right.
She's sometimes called Nazi Barbie by her detractors. And she, she looks very glossy, always sort of perfectly made up, looks very, very smart, and he's constantly posting videos, themes like, they talk about white genocide, their big overriding theory, which you'll hear again and again, which was interesting because it was in the manifesto from the shooter in Christchurch, was this idea of the great replacement.
It's just like the awakening of a consciousness of a whole family of people and cultures that are facing now, in fact, their end, their extinction, their replacement.
The great replacement is the idea simply that all the Muslims who are coming to Europe, they're going to have lots of kids, and eventually they'll be the majority, and there'll be Sharia law, and Christians will be a minority and oppressed by them. That's their big theory. So that's what they are. They always come back to this idea. They say, look, we're not racist, we don't mind Muslims, but they just need to stay in their home countries and not migrate to Europe. So they would do things like, there was a famous one where they were in a theatre in Vienna, and there was a show of migrants who were trying to integrate into Austrian society, and they were putting on this play. Now, because they don't think there is such thing as integration, you've got to assimilate, you can't integrate, you can't have separate identity, you've got to be Austrian. They invaded the stage. They were chucking this fake blood around, and there was a bit of kind of argy-bargy. And there was some arrests. They weren't charged in the end, but we talked to some of the people who were there, and they said it was, it was very scary, it was very aggressive.
How is Austria treating him? Has he been charged with anything?
So there was a big trial last summer, which I went to some of it, of 15 members of Generation Identity, including Martin Sellner, and they were trying to try them as a group for promoting hate speech and hate crime, which was a really difficult to try and prove that and to get a conviction. In the end, they were all acquitted. There were some minor offences that people were found guilty of, but that was a really big deal. What was interesting in the judgment, because the makeup of Austrian politics has changed in the past few years, and the Freedom Party are now in government. The Vice-Chancellor is from the Freedom Party. They're pretty far to the right. And the view that the judge had said, well, actually, a lot of the things they say, you hear the Freedom Party talking about. So, we can't really say they're guilty of hate crime if we've got, one of the main parties in the coalition government saying that. So the balance had shifted over the past few years. So I think they like it when they feel the state is against them, because then you can become a bit of a martyr. And for your supporters, when you're reaching out to these people who feel disenfranchised, it's quite a good way of saying, everyone's against us, come and join us.
Has he been to the UK?
He has, but he won't be now because he was banned last year. He had been quite a few times. He'd met Tommy Robinson, who of course is a whole other story. So he had been a frequent visitor here, and he was due to come here, and he'd been up in Luton with another American far-right campaigner, and they'd been handing out leaflets, and what they would deem to be doing was pretty offensive. And the Home Office had just decided that, they didn't want him in the country anymore. And in the past few days, he has now been banned from travelling to the US as well.
The Christchurch shooting suspect visited Austria last year, but what was he doing there? Bethany Bell, a BBC reporter in Vienna, told us why history is an important place to search for clues.
The clothes and the weapons that the Christchurch suspect wore were covered with writing and lots of symbols. And I found it very interesting because on one of the gun magazines there was the word Vienna, and then there was also a name of a man called Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. Now, a very, very strange, low-key figure, but he was the military commander of Vienna during the Ottoman siege of 1683. And this is a date, a battle, which could just mean someone's interested in history, or it could be a real warning red light sign that you're dealing with someone from the far right, because the siege of Vienna and the battle that freed it is seen as a very, very key date, because that's when the Ottoman, Turkish, Muslim armies were stopped at the gates of Vienna and didn't come further into Western Europe. The siege of Vienna and the Battle of Vienna that freed it is a date that pops up throughout circles of the far right, from extreme right white supremacists, anti-Muslim supremacists, through to more parties which are actually part of the government system here in Austria. So the Vice-Chancellor of Austria is from a party that quite often makes references to the Siege of Vienna. And in fact, they even once published a comic strip cartoon showing him as a knight in the Siege of Vienna beating the Ottoman Turkish armies. And it was a very curious thing. When Austria's new government, which is a coalition of the far right and the conservatives, announced their government plan, they didn't do it in the normal traditional place down in the centre of Vienna. They drove up to the mountain outside the city where the Battle of Vienna took place in 1683 and announced it there. Now, Austria's chancellor said there was nothing to do with history. It was all just coincidence. But the next day, on a video, Martin Sellner said, "This is a good omen. It's a good signal for us."
Peter Neumann is a professor of security studies at King's College London. He studied why we should fear the acceptable face of dangerous ideology. What's the difference between neo-Nazis and the acceptable face of the far right?
If you look at these new far-right movements, you wouldn't necessarily recognize them as far-right. They effectively look like hipsters. They are trying to be modern. The presentation of their message is very much framed in a way that doesn't put people off, because they understand that in previous times, a lot of people who may have agreed with far-right ideas were nevertheless turned off by the way that far-right activists were presenting themselves. So you wouldn't expect people like Sellner to run around with swastikas or in uniforms. I mean, they're basically dressing like everyone else. The other thing that is different is that the ideology hasn't fundamentally changed, but it has slightly changed in emphasis. So whereas neo-Nazis would have focused very much on Jews and were basically arguing that there is a Semitic Jewish conspiracy that basically keeps everyone else down, the new far right, if you want, no longer talks about Jews. They are not that interested in them anymore. That doesn't necessarily make them friends of Jews, but they're just emphasizing a lot more the threat from immigration. They are talking a lot about Muslims, and they are basically seeing themselves as, basically they are arguing this is still the Crusades going on. This is the Islam is at war with the West, and that we have to fight back. As far as Martin Sellner is concerned, one of the tricks of the identitarian movement is that they are no longer talking about race. They are presenting it differently. They're talking about culture. They are talking about European culture, preservation of European culture. But it's not quite clear how this is different from ethnicity or from race. They are saying we need to keep Muslims out in order to preserve our identity. There's a war going on against our identity. But when you ask them, what is it about our identity and our culture makes us different? It basically boils down to Europeans being white people. So I would argue it's effectively the same, even though you will not hear them describing themselves as white nationalists. They will not ask for separation of races, but they will talk about what they call ethno-pluralism, which sounds almost progressive, almost liberal. Who isn't in favor of pluralism, right? But ethno-pluralism basically means segregation of races. And they will not talk about deportation of foreigners or deportation of Muslims. They will talk about remigration, which almost sounds like migration, right? But it basically means deporting people that are not considered to be quote unquote European. And if you ask them who is not considered European, it's basically everyone who is not white.
Is there careful use of language the reason why they are, I don't want to say succeeding, but are successful in promoting their message?
Yes, and I think this is key. It used to be very difficult for people to commit to being a Nazi, to be a skinhead, to be part of a movement that was so fringe that basically no one wanted to have anything to do with you anymore. And the fact that they have changed their presentation, that they are talking differently, that they are not afraid of entering the mainstream, that makes it a lot easier for people to join, and it increases their appeal. Someone like the attacker in Christchurch, who acted on his own, didn't feel like he was acting on his own. He felt like he was part of a big, significant transnational movement. And he had that feeling because he was immersed in these virtual subcultures that basically gave him a sense of being part of something significant, something transnational, and something that he felt was happening and he could contribute to.
To Peter Neumann, Simon Cox, Bethany Bell, Lucy Hancock and Jar Jar Mohammed produced today's episode. It was mixed by Nico Rolfast. And if you like this episode, you can also listen to another one of our programmes about Sellner's favourite theory, the Great Replacement Theory. Is it okay to pay women to have more children? You can find that on BBC Sounds. Do get in touch, let us know what you think. Use the hashtag BeyondToday, or you can email us beyond.today@bbc.co.uk. Matthew will be here tomorrow.